I hope everyone had a good break. I'm Melanie Schaffner, the Director of Sales and Marketing at Project Muse, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm so pleased to bring together this incredible group of speakers to talk about innovating and transforming scholarly communications from within a framework deeply rooted in our shared values. The events of the past several years have had a seismic impact on questions of access, equity, inclusion, and justice within the scholarly communications landscape. All of this is overlaid on longstanding conversations about the sustainability of both traditional and newly emerging models of communicating and sharing scholarly work, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. While working to innovate and improve on these issues within their own organizations, many are also seeking opportunities to connect and collaborate on a broader scale to ensure a positive impact across the wider environment of scholarly research, publication, dissemination, and preservation. For academic libraries and nonprofit publishers embedded within academic organizations, how might we leverage our shared challenges along with our mutual strengths and values to co-create a thriving, durable ecosystem? This group of library professionals are all deeply engaged in the work of advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in scholarly communications through both their individual research and scholarship and their expertise in community building and collective action. I'm eager to begin our conversation, and I also want to invite the audience to share your questions and thoughts. We'll leave time for audience participation towards the end of the hour, so please type your contributions in the Q&A module as you think of them. So let's get started with brief introductions, and you can learn more about our panelists from their complete bios on the Muse Meets webpage. First up, Harriet Green is Associate University Librarian for the Digital Scholarship and Technology Services Division at Washington University in St. Louis. She has presented and published widely on digital humanities, scholarly communications, and humanities research practices. Charlotte Rowe is Reference and Instruction Librarian at California State University, San Marcos. She has a background in academic publishing and works at the intersection of scholarly communications and social justice. Yasmin Shorish is an associate professor, the head of scholarly communication strategies, and special advisor to the dean on equity initiatives at James Madison University Libraries. Her research focuses on changes in scholarly communications, data ethics and privacy, and issues related to representation. And finally, as the director of library initiatives for the Big Ten Academic Alliance, Morris York is responsible for coordinating collective action at scale amongst the research libraries of the BTAA towards their commitment to realizing an interdependent, networked future. He was part of last year's Muse Meets Library panel, and I'm delighted to welcome him back to continue the conversation. So I'll take us right into the deep end of the pool with a discussion about embodying diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in transforming scholarly communication. Our field is advancing rapidly with innovations in publishing technology, product models, researcher services, and more driving us towards a more open and interconnected environment. While many of these innovations may elevate efforts to address EJI, it's important to consider not just intention, but also impact. When we first met to plan this panel, Morris reminded us that many of our current systems were built to preserve particular advantages and power structures, and he challenged us to move beyond surface level shifts that may not address deeper levels of bias and inequity. Yasmin, you posed the question of the need to deconstruct and reconstruct to reach a place where we can begin to have real conversations about justice. I was particularly struck by an observation you made about the potential for carelessness around these concerns, which may be occurring as we move faster and faster towards what some envision as an ideal future. And I'd like to unpack this more. And Yasmin, I'd like to ask you to start us off. How can we do better to ensure that these important values are centered in our work of transforming scholarly communications?
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks for putting together this panel. So I think in order to really get at doing this work, right, centering these values, we need to have a shared understanding of what do we mean when we're talking about these things. And we need to come together and establish that understanding beyond putting the word up on the screen and all of us nodding and saying, yes, we agree this is the definition of justice, it is good, and now let's do it kind of thing. It's about interrogating what does it mean in our context that this is a value? What are the conditions that must be present for this thing, whatever it is that we are talking about, to be demonstrably valuable, right? And that kind of conversation, because we're talking about scholarly communications, which is a large, varied, multi sort of tenant ecosystem, that's a kind of conversation that has to occur continuously and be negotiated with each, like between each stakeholder group, if you will. So within each stakeholder group, there has to be a shared understanding and agreement that in our context, this is what we think equity is. In our context, this is what we think inclusion, representation, a deconstructivist approach, this is what this means. And then when you get disparate groups coming together to talk about, okay, well, what does publishing look like, or what does the funding look like? There also has to be that same conversation occurring. And it's essentially a norming, right, practice that's occurring here, but we are generally completely unskilled in doing this and talking about fraught topics in this way, and allowing for that conversation to be generative, and then doing it all over again with people who may be outside of your home context, right? And recognizing that there might be discrepancies between what each context has determined to be the definition of equity. And then how do you negotiate that so that you're moving forward to that place together productively?
Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of nods among the other panelists. Does anybody want to add anything to that? Morris, do you want to talk a little bit more about what you said in our conversation about those built-in power structures or something else?
Yeah, no, right. There's I hear that in what you're pointing towards, Yasmin, is that the need to be so intentional and so careful about how we have these conversations. And I was just struck, one thing I was quite struck by that there was the Berlin Open Access conference, which was I learned a lot about the Berlin conference. I've never been to it before, but it doesn't meet every year. It meets every few years, and it's been meeting for about 20 years. And at the last one, I think I hadn't met in about 3 years. So and the focus is on, of course, open access, particularly transformative agreements are a center of the conversation about APC models. And they invited a number of voices from what are classified as like lower middle income countries in that, sort of that global economy. And one of the women that spoke, I believe she might have been from South Africa, but talked about how social justice principles were in the bedrock of their negotiating stance that they're actually bringing to the table. And it was a long conversation about other things. And I was like, whoa, I want to hear more about that, and what does that look like? And then it just make you think in the US context, what are those social justice principles? What are the principles of equity and justice? How do you bring that to the negotiating table? And I was looking around, I was like, there's got to be some good research on this. How do we form those kind of principles? So Yasmin, just picking up is like, what does it mean in our context? What do we actually bring forward? What do those mean? And I think we have such an opportunity to crystallize that and do so much. How do we bring those values down into, yes, these are the ways that we bring those to the table? And that just struck me so much, in that conversation. And I think that then to stem over to that kind of system side, Melanie, is that as we've got numerous kinds of infrastructure that are trying to catch up with the conversation, so publishers are building infrastructure. We're trying to build academy-owned, we might call it public or open infrastructure. We'll talk about that a little bit. But as those systems are being built, what are they being built for, and for whom? Are they being built for just to stem out of a lot of the economic and market forces and academic crosswinds that are already there, or are we trying to build something that's more open and more intentional? And as others are building that infrastructure too. So as an example of one of those things that we can think about and bringing to the table is if we're counting on publishers to build infrastructure and workflows that allow authors to go through an open access workflow and things like that, well, we have no idea what they're building, and are they doing it to the kind of standards and requirements that we would really want to see if we're serious about bringing this lens to really shaping something that is more equitable and just.
Very important. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that before we move on?
I do think that opportunity that Morris was just talking about, and how do we inform what, in this case, like publishers might be doing, is an important one to really dig into a bit more and think about what are the opportunities that we have as folks working with information producers and creators who want to work in the open landscape and find the variety of open pathways. I'm just picking on this one aspect. Really inconsistent and confusing and difficult to navigate, right? How are we able to build off of the sort of norming that we've done for our own context, right? That's a critical foundational step. And then take that work and have the conversation with those systems providers and recognize the potential for influence, the potential for possible genuine partnership, or if nothing else, a market reality of service providing to build out those things more in line with principles or with just a user experience, like a user-centered approach to things. That these things are all intertwined with one another from my perspective. And so that means that the opportunities to have a great impact on multiple fronts is there. We need to take advantage of those opportunities, and we need to exert our influence in a more, I would argue, a more assertive and confident manner. But it does require that context setting, that norming, that foundation work. There's a bit of introspective internal interrogation that has to happen. It's a lot of I alliteration there. But I think that can happen, and then we would be much stronger as a voice, as a community, to have influence, right?
Thank you. Now, this is a great segue into the next topic I was going to move into, which is you brought up this idea of looking internally, to ourselves. So, Charlotte, in your presentation on doing diversity work in scholarly communications at the recent ERNL conference, you said we need to see ourselves as part of the problem. And that really resonated for me. I agree wholeheartedly. And I wanted to ask you to speak more about how we can individually and collectively work towards change for the better.
Yeah, I think so far it's been really positive that we can be values-based and we can really examine our values and look internally. It's all really, really necessary and important. And I think we also need to examine where we are the problem. For me personally, as like an able-bodied, cisgender, heteronormative Asian American woman with I have a lot of privilege. I have, a graduate degree, I have a resume that reads really well to a sort of white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal framework. So I've also had to do a lot of unlearning about the problems that I've encountered and racial triangulation and all these things that I've been a part of, right? And I think if we as scholarly communications professionals and people in part of the system don't recognize that we hold within ourselves as individuals and as professionals these problems that are societal, then we're going to fail in our ideals and values, right? We're going to fail. We're going to do things like, I will not name this publisher, but hire a white man to be head of diversity in HR, who says he has a lot of diverse friends. We're going to do things like not pay people equitably in our organizations. That is 100% happening right now, right? So publishing, scholarly communications, librarianship, academia, all of these are predominantly white spaces, right? This is not like a surprise to anybody. And therefore, they are violent spaces, right? They are violent spaces to people of color who are not being paid enough. They're violent spaces to queer folks who are not represented in narratives. And that has impacts for scholarship. It has impacts for our world, for our narratives. And a lot of you all in the audience are doing really, really important work and supporting really important authors. And that makes us feel like we're the good guys, right? So I think we can all be better at doing that, right? We can all be better at it, and we can all be better in our practices, right? I know some publishers are really working on name changes for trans folks. That's been like a really beautiful change that I've been seeing. That's like easy, but you have to implement it, and that part is not so easy, but that kind of thing. And I think we can work harder on all those things. But yeah, we need to see ourselves as part of the problems, because just because we're doing good work, right? Just because we're working with diverse authors doesn't mean that we're not subject to some introspection and some change. So that's my.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else on that topic? I feel like that's something that we can all think about and talk about the rest of the day, but there's so many things we wanted to talk about, but very important. Harriet, please.
I mean, for me, I think a key part of that is thinking of the assumptions that each of us as individuals come into in these spaces. And I know in my own work, thinking about as Yasmin and Morris were talking about, the systems and the structures that we're assuming that how scholarly communication works and how they come into, and saying, okay, let's think outside the box. And some of the work that I did, like a project we did with the Triangle Scholarly Communications Institute, where we had to think about a cultural ways that we're communicating and publishing about a certain type of scholarship that involves stance. And so really thinking and Afro kind of cultural norms and different types of cultural ways of communicating a certain type of scholarship. So for me, I think individually, can each of us step back and think about the assumptions we're coming into it?
Thank you.
I love what you were just saying, Harriet. You're talking about recognizing the different norms. I think this goes back to a value statement, though, right? Like what kinds of knowledge and what kinds of ways of knowing and expressing that knowledge and sharing that knowledge are valued, right? And we know it's not all of them. Like we're only just barely getting to a cohesive space with elder like knowledge keeping oral traditions as citable knowledge, right? I think that what are our values? What are the conditions in which we recognize them as valuable? This ways of knowing, what are the different ways of knowing, of experiencing the world, and translating those experiences into a knowledge base, and then communicating that knowledge to others who may be coming from a different context, a different set of experiences, a different way of reckoning with what the world means to them, and exchanging those ideas. I mean, this is the basic principle, but we've been trying to shut everything into a singular package to share that, right? And it's coming from a dominant narrative space, a dominant cultural space that Charlotte was speaking of. And that just is super inadequate, actually, right? It's not just destructive or harmful or erasing, it's inadequate for the totality of the kinds of experiences and knowledge that gets created. So I think it really is this deconstructing, reconstructing exercise, and then thinking about how are we recognizing those norms and experiences and ways of knowing.
Thank you. No, you briefly touched there on sort of Indigenous knowledge and folkways, and that brings to mind for me a project that I know is happening within the university press community on building some infrastructure for, in particular, Indigenous scholarship. And in Indigenous knowledge. And that's sort of a good segue to our next topic. And as we move on to that, I'll just remind our viewers that you are welcome to drop your questions and comments in the Q&A so that we can address them after the discussion. So thinking about that bigger picture of infrastructure and supporting different kinds of knowledge, one way that we can better ensure that our work embodies our values is by ownership of the infrastructures that underpin it. And during her keynote address at last year's Muse Meets, Kathleen Fitzpatrick called on higher education to turn away from the current proliferation of proprietary systems for scholarly communication and to instead reserve our investments for systems and platforms and infrastructures whose missions and values align with our own. Historian and journal editor Sylvester Johnson continued in that vein, describing us as tenants of our digital ecosystem, one primarily created and controlled by private corporations, and expressed his concern that the Academy needed to stop renting. But he also acknowledged that it's going to take more capital than ever before to achieve an inclusive, equitable level of participation in the ownership of the digital infrastructure. In a paper based on her talk at the 2020 NISO Plus conference, Knowledge Infrastructure and the Role of the University, MIT Press Director Amy Brand asserted, research universities are in the business of creating and transmitting knowledge. They are the locus of empirical research and critical inquiry. They contain libraries and some even have university presses. Yet they have historically underinvested in capturing and communicating the knowledge being created on their campuses. So it's clear that there's a need for more sustainable, equitable infrastructure maintained by the Academy for the Academy. But what's lacking is not ideas, but resources and momentum. So to borrow a question that Amy Brand posed in that paper, how do we foster collaboration and collective investment within and across universities? More specifically, how might libraries and university-based publishers collaborate to amplify our respective investments and expertise? And what barriers exist to this kind of collaboration? And Harriet, would you like to start this one off?
Certainly. And again, thank you for this great discussion so far. So as also this morning's keynote noted, libraries and publishers would seem to be on opposite sides, but we do have those common interests of disseminating knowledge, advancing scholarship. And I note that we also value collaboration and how the ways we do work. And it's coming from both work experiences in publishing as well as libraries. I've seen the contrasts of traditionally we approach it from two different angles. The libraries may connect at live evolving points in the research lifecycle as scholars are researching, finding resources, while publishers traditionally are at the end point of that dissemination. But it doesn't have to stay that way. And as everybody on this panel has deep experience with, we can reconceive the ways that we engage in scholarly communications and research. And one thing I thought of ways that we collaborate is that we recognize that we hold roles of stature in the research ecosystem. You might say the prestige economy. And so that libraries are where scholarship is often preserved, and whereas publishers are that golden key to promotion and tenure. So we each have this role in terms of permanence, of keys to the establishment, so to speak. So how can we leverage this stature to forge these new roles in creation of knowledge and scholarly communications? In my experience, there are more and more approaches to transform these systems and networks. And I participated in a Mellon-funded initiative in Illinois. It was called Publishing Without Walls, but there were a number of other major universities such as Stanford, Duke, and Cincinnati, where we're looking at this large-scale effort of how to transform new ways of publishing and scholarly communications that critically involve these collaborations across libraries and publishers. And I note that Amy Brand noted that there's often, what is that full implication of the full commercial life cycle? And so in the same way, can libraries and publishers equally collaborate to replicate the convenience of commercial publishing, but also use our credentials and our authority and our ways of knowledge making to disseminate scholarship in agile ways? And some of the barriers that I see that have really come up in this have been scarcity. So libraries dealing with scarcity in terms of providing resources, and we can find ourselves providing resources, publishers and presses, as we see in the news, in this vicious cycle of trying to be self-sufficient, trying to maintain resources. But I think collaborating together, even though it involves huge risk, we can mitigate that risk by working together and leverage our roles, leverage the powerful tools that we each still have to transform our scholarly communications and networks. So that's just to start with what I see.
Yeah, it really is about those shared challenges, but also shared values and working together. Anyone else want to jump in on that topic? Go ahead, Charlotte.
I can jump in on this. So I'm on the advisory board for Next Generation Library Publishing, which, if you're not familiar with it, is creating a platform that's supposed to be modular and sort of solve the problem of platform capture in library publishing specifically. And we all have encountered this platform capture in various ways across our institutions. And it is scary and distressing because a lot of this platform capture is, of course, capitalism, and therefore has problems with surveillance and privacy and the bias within the systems themselves. Yeah, I mean, speaking to Harriet's point about university presses and libraries working together, they are natural, allies in this, because we are both, I think, not so much profit driven as maybe like a commercial journal publisher might be, right? Although we all live in the same ecosystem. But I just want to reinforce Harriet's point about scarcity, because in the last panel, I did hear a lot about subscribing. And libraries are cut to the bone, basically. We're not even being given money to keep pace with inflation. We're being cut on top of that. And I don't know if that's something that publishers are aware of, or it's a deliberate strategy to try to cut libraries out of the market, much like, Amazon's trying to cut public libraries out of the market, right? Like what is going to happen when university administrators continue to see the library as a place to cut? What implication does that have for publishers, right? I just don't know. But that's a very real thing that's happening. And I just wanted to highlight what Harriet said there.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that is a very important point, and it's actually sort of it's a good segue into my next question, just sort of moving from the big picture of infrastructure down to more specific modes of sharing scholarship. And as several of you have mentioned, you have experience in library publishing and university press settings as part of your professional journeys, and you've seen firsthand the challenges of our current models for scholarly publishing. The past several years have seen many experiments, from APCs to publish and read models to collaborative funding like the Tome Initiative for OA monographs, and emerging journal models such as Subscribe to Open and others that were discussed on the panel this morning. And some have gained traction, and others, such as Tome, are in a stage of assessment to determine the next steps. And one thing that's clear is many of the models designed with STEM scholarship in mind will not effectively translate to the humanities. And one thing that really stayed with me from our planning discussion, Morris, was you describing BTAA's efforts to collectively invest in open scholarship and finding a dearth of tangible, pragmatic initiatives that you could actually help fund. And you posed a question that I'd like to revisit now, and I think is really sort of relevant to what we've just been talking about, which is how we can move from ideas and intentions into tangible models that have the potential to change the marketplace. So could you start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Harriet, as you were talking, I was thinking about, and that maybe there's a connecting thread here, and to build off some of what you were indicating there, and to pull that into this frame too in this discussion, is that, I mean, so it's evident that we need different business models. We need different financial models. We need new ways of working together, because that's what's called for. The systems that exist were not built for open scholarship. They just weren't. So you either have to create new systems, or you have to take what was there and transform it. And particularly when we look at what the Academy owns, and it's very interesting when we look back over time, this will be a high, broad statement, but we might be able to say the Academy is not proven itself so effective at actually running businesses. It's not our job. We're not here to run businesses. That's what the economic realm is for. And yet we have some models that sort of mimic what the commercial realm does. So in presses, for example, it's all a copies sold model. That doesn't necessarily fit what we're trying to do, or the ideals that we have, or what we're working for. So what are the new models that we can put in place that are based on something other than copies sold? That might be effective. It might work in the commercial realm. We may not be equipped to say that, but we can say that we probably need something different in the academy. And similarly, we could move into the journal marketplace and others and say, well, we really need our new business models. And that, so the observation I made is like, it's hard to find the pragmatic models to invest in. We're starting to see a lot of really good articulation of ideals, the things that we're working for. A lot of people really thinking about, and they're much needed, and there's really, really great thinking going into how do we articulate those. It's hard to pour money into an ideal, right? So where's the vessel for that? Where's the thing that say we can put money behind that? We can see that and see how it goes. I mean, like to step back a little bit to this like historical arc view. So we could say, let's say for the last, 30 years, whatever it's been, that the journal marketplace, let's take that as an example, has been based on a closed model of subscriptions, paying to read. We have a product, you will buy it, the company will keep the rights, the author gives those rights to the company, and then we resell it. Then we have the effort to open up scholarship. So it was probably about 20 years ago that, and it was PLOS that introduced the APC model, I believe, said, well, we need some sort of model that says, we'll open up the knowledge rather for paying for the subscription. How about this? We'll pay on the front end with an article processing charge, pay up front. And it was, I think it should be notable for us that it was only in the last couple of years, PLOS looked back and said, well, we started that, the marketplace rapidly adopted it, right? And PLOS looked at it and said, well, I don't know if that was exactly the way that we want things to go. Let's try a couple of other models. And PLOS is working with that right now, experimenting with a couple of different models other than the APC. Meanwhile, what's happened is that the APC has become very successful. 20 years ago, it was nothing. The marketplace was closed and subscription driven. But it was really an important reminder for me. It was just last week. It was like that the APC was never meant to be, it was always meant to be transitional. It was never meant to be the stopping place. And the one sort of shadow side we might be seeing right now is that it's been great, very successful. It's actually, I think, almost becoming half of the market now, maybe even more in that particular model of open. It's the danger we're facing right now is that the market forces and the publishers and so forth may want us to bring us to stasis in the APC. Everyone always knew it wasn't the final model. It was supposed to be a transition. It's not supposed to be the goal or the place we come to, right? And so this is where I am carefully watching these other models that are emerging, and they're much smaller things like sometimes it's called Diamond Open Access, sometimes it's called community. There was a wonderful term like commercial, non-commercial open access, things like cooperative open access, things like that. They're small, they need encouragement, they need investment in order for them to grow. While the APC market is huge, it's not supposed to be where we stop, right? So I almost look at these other models as seeds, to invest and grow. We're all learning. We don't know which one or ones of them will be the ones that should become the actual market that we want, the actual scholar. So right now it's like, how do we invest in and seed a number of them, what I think what I was indicating there is like, what would be wonderful is it's those vehicles to create that we can invest in, things we can put money in. Right now, some of those structures also are like designed around individual institutions to contribute money, say to a Diamond Open Access, a journal that's trying to go towards a model where authors don't pay and things like that, but not in APCs. And it's hard for, say, a consortia like the Big Ten Academic Alliance to go and invest in lots of tiny journals, So something we might imagine more like a portfolio-based approach or something like that. How do we intentionally seed and grow these models so that we can create the actual sustainable, scalable, trustworthy, just ecosystem, not open knowledge ecosystem that we know is supposed to be there, and that we can take the lead foot rather than the marketplace saying, well, hey, what's great is that these subscription models, and we replaced it with these APC models and things like that. And it's a wonderful transformation, right? We need that, but we got to push through and move beyond it. And we got to do that with great intention so that we don't accidentally get caught inside of something that was never meant to be the permanent state. So
that's a very interesting, the sort of that idea of inertia, and that leads very nicely into the next question I was going to ask. It's like you all knew, which is just thinking about this idea of inertia and sort of getting stuck, something works. And so we get stuck in it, and think, okay, now we've figured it out. And when we were having our planning discussion and talking about open monographs in particular, it left me wondering how limiting it might be to continue to think about open scholarship in terms of those traditional containers of books and journals. And Yasmin, you in particular asked, how can and should monographic publishing, and I'll say just publishing in general, exert influence in the disciplinary cultures of recognition and reward, and how we sort of got stuck in these models. So I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm actually going to tie it even more to what Morris was just talking about, because the APCs didn't work. They weren't really working in the way that one might have hoped until the system was more co-opted by the commercial for-profit publishers through hybrid journals and mirror OA journals and all of these permutations of market capture, basically, by way of APC. And I think part of why that happened, why it was not allowed to really even be a transitionary state, right? Because you had to build up to something to transition to. And that wasn't built yet before the APCs were really widely adopted. It wasn't built in a cohesive, agreed upon way that served the community because of these pressures from recognition, from reward, and disciplinary culture, right? And so it just left it open for co-opting. So the idea of how can publishing from any sector influence these cultures, right? You said of recognition and reward. And this is the question, really, of people working in scholarly communications and trying to do outreach from libraries. And it is this cultural clash because scholars working in a field want their work to be read, to be meaningful, to affect, there's usually some contribution there, like we want to move the field in this direction, or we want to highlight this particular thing, and that is a form of cultural enrichment happening within a field through scholarship, through knowledge dissemination, and those of us who might be working from a more let's have more inclusive representation of knowledge, let's reduce barriers, open landscapes, that is a clash right there. And so there needs to have, again, that kind of, it's just almost getting to know each other better, right? Like respect where everyone's coming from, and then talk. Like have the dialogue, have the explanation of, hey, from my context, not me personally, but like speaking from this positionality, this range of expertise, these experiences, here is how and why I think this kind of publishing atmosphere would be really conducive to getting your disciplinary culture, out there, getting your work read for the folks that you value, whose opinions you value, and folks who you don't even know exist, but would want to read your work and claim it to be valuable to a broader audience, right? Like these things can happen, but it goes back to Harriet's comment of scarcity. And it's not even scarcity of monetary resource in this case. It's the scarcity of time, right? How do you build the time to essentially relationship build, share cultural norms and knowledge with one another with the intention of not just sharing to learn, but to change? We may need to change some of the way that we approach publishing and processes and workflows in response to what we hear. And we want them to change what they think of our reputable, trustworthy, prestige, right, impact-driven venues or forms of scholarship, to your original question. And that is very hard to negotiate from both constituents in this case, right? This work that we've been talking about throughout the whole panel is in its most bare bones kind of take about, do we actually value these things? And if we value them, what are we going to do to show that they're valuable? We prioritize them. We prioritize them via time. We prioritize them via personnel resources. We prioritize them via monetary resources. We work as a collective instead of as an individual. That is what it means to demonstrate the value of something. And in the end, I don't know that we're actually there. Not to end on like a downer note, but I don't know if as a field, as a profession, as an ecosystem, we're actually there to say, yes, these are our values. And they are integral to the work that we do in higher ed and beyond. It's a place that we should be much more concerned, maybe that we're not speaking with that voice, and thinking really hard about what needs to change to make sure that we can.
Yeah. I feel like so many of these things, we could just spend a whole hour talking about any one of these topics. And, to sort of take that, I think you're correct. It's very aspirational at the moment. And to sort of move that maybe back into a little bit more practical space. And again, I'll just remind the audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A as we move on to this last topic that I wanted to talk about, which is that looking at the growing movement within libraries and publishing to really live our values through our work. So recently I attended a community forum on the Next Generation Library Publishing Project, which Charlotte mentioned earlier. And they were presenting their new report on values-aligned approaches to transformative scholarly communication. And while this was focused on library-based publishing, I heard many echoes of other recent talks I've attended about new frameworks for values-based collection development in libraries. And themes of resilience, openness, accountability, transparency, and anti-oppression were all very common in the documents that I've seen. And at ERNL last month, Charlotte, you made the really important point that these rubrics and values and documents must actually correspond to outcomes. So how are these aspirational frameworks operating in strategic collection development decisions, investments in new publishing models, or other aspects of our daily work to ensure that our actions actually align with our stated intentions? So Charlotte, could you start us off on that one?
Sure. I mean, in terms of collection development, I know that libraries have been making an effort to buy more authors of color or on topics that have been previously marginalized. Like a lot of libraries have been prioritizing the acquisitions of that work, right? So that's not a huge lift, right? To just like purchase the things that come by that they think are interesting. A lot of scholars and professors have been requesting those items as well. So it goes hand in hand with serving the population. In terms of like journal publishing and the practice of journal publishing, I think we saw a lot of mistakes in the beginning of sort of like the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody all of a sudden became aware of Black Lives Matter, where like people tried to do like the special issue with like the lack of editorial expertise, and those there had to be apologies made, basically, right? So I think the outcomes kind of tie back to the beginning of this conversation where we have to know ourselves a little better, right? And where our problems are and where our values are. Um, I recently put out an article with some co-authors about library journals in particular, and we found that as much as everybody said they were doing equity and diversity work, like in practice, it wasn't there, right? And I have been engaged with also like C4Disc, which I don't know if you all are familiar with, as well as the Library Publishing Coalition's ethical framework, and it's the same thing, right? On the up like meta level, we're all talking about equity and diversity and want to get it done, but in practice, it's much harder because we need to take, as Yasmin said, time to like educate ourselves, right? So yeah, like when it comes to like the ground level of outcomes, we're not seeing yet, I don't think, right? As much as we're trying our best, like the AUP, and we've all realized that we need to have like more sustained outcomes, like the AUP's fellowship for diversity fellowship. One of the main points was that these fellows should go on to careers. It shouldn't end at this fellowship. So we all know that what we need is a sustained effort, right, across time in order to make these changes. I'm worried because I'm already seeing some like pushback, right? Like book banning notwithstanding, like even within institutions, people who's have been hired as like equity and diversity roles, like have been asked to change their titles, things like that. Like I've been seeing that. So yeah, I don't. We just need to see this going on for longer, and it's a lot because we've all been going through this pandemic, and it's very intense. Sorry, my chat's coming in. But I think that I think that keeping up the energy is going to be the most important thing to getting these changes made that we want to get made, if we really do want to get them made, right? I also, sorry, I'm going to call back to what Morris said about business models and new emerging APC models that are happening. I want to say that the APC model wasn't new and introduced by PLOS because it actually existed as a paper format because it was actually intended to like pay for color and like more pages if you like had like a really intense paper, and they sort of borrowed it, right? And now it's of course been co-opted, but I really encourage you all to look up Ariana Becerril Garcia, who is head of Redelec. She has the most cogent and persuasive and excellent model of open access publishing I've seen out of the University of Mexico. I think there is this racism that's happening in the West where we don't see other models that are not Western, right? And Central South America has been doing open access publishing for much longer. Like, I think like Cielo existed before the Berlin like initial open access announcement, like determination for open access was made, right? So I mean, we can just point to like this pandemic to how like our Western model of doing things is maybe not the most civilized model, right? So that's my that's my little 2 cents there.
Oh, thank you. I just feel like we could talk all afternoon on so much of this, and I hate to sort of conclude or stop the conversation, but we do have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. So thank you all for your very compelling contributions to this discussion. I know I'm going to be thinking about this for days to come, so much to think about, and really, it's as much introspective as it is, looking externally to what we're doing. But let's turn now to see if there are any questions that have come in from the audience while we were talking. We do want to make sure we get to that. So while we're looking for that, I had a question. I thought this was actually a question that came in during Karen Wolf's Q&A this morning, and she did address it, but I really thought that it's the kind of thing that there are many good answers, and that it would be interesting to pose it again for your thoughts and perspectives. And the question was about how many early career humanists face complex publishing choices in publish or perish environments. And I think this kind of harkens back somewhat to Yasmin, what you were talking about a little while ago, that, I'll add that this might seem especially fraught for researchers from underrepresented communities, first-gen scholars, or those working in interdisciplinary or emerging fields. And the question was, what can institutions do to support these researchers and help them connect with not-for-profit and other ethical publishing systems? I wondered if any of you had some thoughts on that.
Well, I'll build off, a little bit of what was mentioned before, and you talk about what institutions can do, right? Well, they can overhaul their recognition and rewards systems, like that, because folks who are trying to get into the field have to conform to the metrics that are put in front of them, and those are outdated generally, right? And mimicking the past, echoing the past. So if we want to really talk about evolving the discipline, making the space for these diverse forms of knowledge and scholarship to exist, then the recognition structure has to be overhauled to do that. It won't happen while you're still holding people to that other metric because of inertia and time. So everyone thinks that it will, but it won't.
Yeah.
And,
Harriet?
and I might add, and some of this work has already occurred, but collaborating also with professional organizations that set a lot of the standards for different disciplines, and certainly the MLA and AHA, I know off the top of my head, have done this and more as well, as recognizing different forms of scholarship so that scholars can point to standards that they can then take to institutions. And then, yeah, as Yasmin said, institutions recognizing that and educating their staff, their faculty on, this is what we're recognizing now as promotion and tenure. So I think it's a collaborative effort, all of our professional networks.
Thank you. Here's a very provocative and I think great question from the audience. Starts with a comment. New models come from new members and new minds. How do we displace traditional power structures within publishing to include folks who have not traditionally been included? There's a big one. Anyone thoughts on that?
So I might be coming at this a bit sideways. So the phrase that caught my attention there was displace power structures, the existing power structures. So just where I might come at sideways is like a little bit broader reflection. So there is, on the one hand, capsizing the market, capsizing the patriarchal system that's in place, capsizing the hierarchies, things like that. The thing we need to consider carefully is, let's say we got our wish. Let's say we blew them all away tomorrow. Would there be anything there to fill the space? Right. So when we talk about, and there could be unintentional consequences, right? I mean, I would propose, I was like, I don't think the models are there to fill the space. What might fill that vacuum might unintentionally be something even worse. It might not have been what we actually wanted. So I would advocate for a little more of it takes longer, right? But it's also is like it allows for this intention, this careful thinking of, rather than displacing, of like, we could think of it a number of ways, of balancing, of transforming. And I'd suggest that, like, one way of thinking about that. So on the one hand, we have the hierarchies and the power structures that exist. On the other hand, we have more of lateral and embracive gesture, the community, if you will. And the community wants to be inclusive. It embodies all the values we're talking about. It wants to be equitable. And the hierarchy was not built to do that. So what we might be looking at is actually a joining of the hierarchy with the community. If we threw aside the hierarchy, the community, I mean, as we've been talking about, it's not necessarily organized enough to be able to just sweep in and say, hey, we've got the answer, right? So it's more, the way I look at it is a joining between the two, because the hierarchy knows how to do some things very well. The community knows how to do things very well. If the two of them join together, are what I'm searching for, is what I've been trying to discover. That I think in the joining of those two is where we need those new models. And that's really hard. It's very hard work. So.
And I think that speaks to a paths decision, right? Are you looking for reform or are you looking for revolution? And reform is that joining, it takes more time, it's collaborative, and it iteratively disrupts the system to get to a end state that is more just and equitable. And the revolution path is as a revolution, you disrupt wholesale, usually through destructive means, because the system will always self-preserve, and the time that it takes to get to the end state, the hoped for end state, is so long that the harm that's done in the interim is just unacceptable. And so the risk of, destruction and the aftermath that comes with it is worth it to do the revolution. And everyone, in my opinion, falls into one of those two camps. You're in a revolution camp or you're in a reform camp. And your individual risk tolerance will be the determinant factor into which camp you fall into. Because if we're talking about the academy, we're talking about promotion and tenure, we're talking about publishing, we're talking about money. And if we're talking about money, we're talking about market systems, and we're talking about capitalism. And so we're not talking about, we're just going to have a revolutionary in higher ed, or we're just going to have a revolution in publishing. That's a revolution at society level, or it's reform at society level. And I think if we can get ourselves out of a slightly myopic view of what we're really talking about when we're talking about these changes, and recognize that this is actually a societal context that we're operating in and that we're influencing, and make our decisions from there, we'll go farther even on the reform path.
Anyone else? Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And it's sort of tying into what you were saying, that this, everyone's on their particular path. And to bring us back maybe to a positive space of action, one of the questions was, what specific investments have panelists and the organizations made to support alternative or emerging forms of publishing? And also to open that up a little more specifically to, we know that there are initiatives happening right now to transform scholarly communications. And I wanted to ask you, what collective investment and action is happening that you think requires our engagement and our support to sustain its momentum? What are important things we should all be thinking about supporting now? Just open that up to anybody who wants to talk about something they're really impressed by.
I can briefly speak to some of the work that we're actively doing now at WashU, where we've made explicit commitments to open infrastructure as we build out for journal publishing, with Janeway and working on building now different infrastructure for our collections and repository, and supporting things such as the American Chemical Society for open, enabling more open access publishing. So for us, it's been iterative, but harkening back to our early conversation, what are even smaller iterative choices? So it doesn't always have to be the big bang, we're getting rid of the big deal, but what are the small things that we can do, relatively small? There's still very major things that we can do to work our way towards more open infrastructure, enabling more scholarly communication. So both looking at our systems and then what we purchase in terms of collections as well.
Yeah, and I've also been, I'm interested to see where MIT Press's direct to open, how that continues and sustains, because I think I'm pretty optimistic about how they've structured it thus far, and hopefully we'll see it persist and potentially be a model that becomes more normative across the presses.
Great.
I do want to mention, and just to bring in the conversation, the Humetrics HSS initiative, the Humane Metrics Initiative, that tries to say, how do we create a new set of metrics and values for the Academy that's not based in some of the reputational and kind of things that we have right now. But just their motto at the top of their website is live your values, transform the Academy. And they're especially trying to create metrics around things like equity, openness, collegiality, soundness, things like that. So that's one thing I'm watching with great interest. They do really, really good work there.
Great, thank you. So we are sadly out of time. I can keep talking to all of you all afternoon. So thank you, everyone. Charlotte, Harriet, Yasmin, Morris. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to engage in co-creating this panel with you. And I'm so grateful for your contributions of your time and your expertise. And I want to say thank you also to our audience for joining us and for your questions and comments about these crucial topics. And we definitely look forward to continuing these conversations with all of our colleagues in the scholarly communications community. Thank you, everyone. If you missed part of today's panel or any other live Muse Meet sessions, please watch the Project Muse YouTube channel, where we will be posting all the recordings after the event. And right now, we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we hope to meet many of you at the 2 networking sessions this afternoon. You can see the Muse Meets webpage for additional details and the Zoom link to join in. And please plan to join us again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern for more live programming. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day.